Thank you, Mr. Tide. Members will now be recognized in order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and if time allows, an additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. Without objection, the chair seeks permission for the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, and the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, to also waive on to this committee. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning, and again, thank the witnesses for your statements. I'll start with you, Mr. Grossev. Maybe give us an idea of how this could happen in the United States. Talk us through a scenario that you've investigated that technology and location, things that we can kind of put it into context and understand in layman's terms.
In terms of technology, I'm not an expert in the technology behind this, but I've read enough and I'm sufficiently technically minded to understand that there's more than one way to achieve this same effect on the human brain. And one of the most disturbing denials that I've seen in some of the publications leading up to our findings being published was an attempt to create the impression that no technology would allow this impact on the human brain. That is provably untrue. There have been experiments that prove that both acoustic and waves, directed waves in the ultrasound, primarily the ultrasound band, but also electromagnetic directed energy, especially pulsed nanosecond energy beams in the millimeter band through something called the Frey effect, which converts electromagnetic energy into an acoustic band wave that can be within or without or outside of the audible band, can have the same effect on the human brain, which can have long-term concussion-like symptoms, but in really traumatic degree of concussion. So that is a given, and I don't think today we have the expertise to talk about that, but there's sufficient evidence that that is possible. We also know that the Russian intelligence apparatus has worked on that, and something I would like to mention as well is that after our publication, a former member of Russia's intelligence community reached out to me and said, well, this is what we've been working on since the 80s, because we thought that the Americans were doing that to us, and we wanted to develop a counter technology for the same thing. So of course we're doing that, which is interesting because Russian intelligence officers believe they're doing this, and American intelligence officers saying they're not doing this too.
Did this individual, this Russian agent, remain anonymous?
Unfortunately for their own safety, I'll have to leave them anonymous. But it's a person with, in my view, sufficient knowledge of exactly the intents, the red lines that this entity would be exposed to. We know that members of this unit have engaged with scientists who have worked on a project called reversal of epilepsy symptoms through radio waves, which, for anybody known how Russia intelligence formulates their findings for the public-facing domain, should read them as the exact opposite, creating, reversing essentially the polarity, might leave with the exact opposite effect, creating epilepsy symptoms, and so on and so forth. This interest is long-running for the GRU, for Russia's military intelligence. One last thing I will mention is that we found that the only other place, other than among the cohort of American and Canadian intelligence and law enforcement officers who have been affected by this, that we've seen very, very similar symptoms, was in a Russian school in 2017. And we found the evidence to this similarity in a hacked email box of a military researcher from the St. Petersburg Institute for Experimental Medicine working for the GRU. This institute showed uncanny interest in exactly what happened in that school, where 26 children complained of exactly the symptoms that we've received in this investigation from American officers and diplomats. And again, it was this institute that followed up and did research and may have been behind those incidents in Russia, but we don't see them anywhere else other than around Russian operatives.
Mr. Zayed, is it your belief that these attacks have happened inside the United States? And if so, can you give us some of the locations and details that you can share with us?
Yes, without a doubt, they have happened here in the United States. As I mentioned in my opening testimony, we know of quite a number, and I would say perhaps the majority of them were in the Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia area. There are also a number, particularly of FBI personnel, down in Florida. I do know of some other locations of which I can tell you more about in a more private situation, not necessarily because of classification, but for privilege of the individual client not to reveal it. But there is no doubt there have been quite a number of cases here, particularly relating to the CIA and FBI most predominantly, also State Department.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member for his line of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, what I've heard today is very disturbing. Before I get to my questions, I just want to reiterate that we're going to do everything we can to assure that the victims, those that are suffering, will receive consistent health care for what is ailing you. But, Mr. Edgren, the evidence, no intentional attack, yet what I'm hearing from Mr. Zaid, Mr. Grozov, is that there's a possibility that something is out there attacking us, especially in Homeland. Mr. Edgren, based on what Mr. Zaid just said, what are your thoughts?
My personal thoughts
As an intelligence officer.
is that I agree with them. My personal opinions is that this is a global campaign, and it includes attacking us here at home. It is a strategic issue that is going to impact us.
Is this a attack by the Russians, just the Russians, and is it against the U.S. solely or other allies as well?
I have to be careful what I say here. So let me say this.
And if I can, say what you can. And if you gentlemen feel better talking about this in a more secure setting,
I'll start by
we can
saying
work
this.
on that as well.
Congressman, thank you for the question. Give me 20 minutes in a skiff, and I'll convince all of you. I know where the bodies are buried. I know the cabinets to look in, the questions to ask, and the people to subpoena. I will say that this is a global campaign, and it's focused on attacking our people, the best of our people. It's not the middle-range people that are being attacked. It's those that are succeeding in providing work that winds up on the president's desk every morning. So it's a massive issue. It's something that doesn't come to light, and it's something that, especially with the Department of Defense survivors, the unseen, they're totally left out of this because the Havana Act doesn't cover your active duty members. They're told to go to the VA, but there's no VA diagnostic code, so we're not getting them care. It's not consistent. We have funding available that's allocated that we could provide to take care of all of our people in our government. We're not using it. That's why I'd urge you to contact the Defense Health Program.
In my last 2.5 minutes, would you say this is more on behalf of the U.S. government in terms of what we've been looking at? Is this more of a malfeasance as opposed to misfeasance?
That's a good question. I'm sure, just like so many other issues, it's a combination. I can't explain some of the obstacles that those in the government have erected to block information. I can tell you, firsthand
But
that
your opinion would be that that information is being blocked?
There is information that is absolutely being blocked from one agency to the other, particularly at the CIA. I mean, that's who we're going to point to the most, of information that the CIA has that its sister intelligence agencies it hasn't been shared with. And I can identify a number of specific classified documents in a proper setting.
Mr. Grozov, any thoughts?
I would like to be the devil's advocate and allow for the possibility for some legitimate reasons why the U.S. government and intelligence offices, agencies might not want to make this a public issue. One of the few legitimate explanations for this, in my mind, is the fear of proliferation of such a weapon in case it becomes widely known that it's achievable, feasible, and maybe not too costly to manufacture. That's why I don't require public answers to our findings, but I encourage skiff answers to everything we found out to you and to government, so that we exclude the possibility that it's, if that is the case, of an attack on American officials by the Russian state.
Is there any way to protect our officials from these weapons?
This is exactly why I do not take into account a possible legitimate reason for hiding this, because from my personal point of view, making this public is the best protection.
My last few seconds, Mr. Redgren. Any thoughts?
The best way to protect our people is to fight back. When you're hit in the shadows, you have to hit back twice as hard and tell your adversary why you did that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time. I'll yield.
The gentleman yields. Now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for showing up. Many Americans, including other members that I've spoken to recently, don't exactly know what to think of these anomalous health incidents. I spoke to one the other day, just yesterday, who said, I thought that was debunked. Like Havana syndrome, where our citizens are claiming very serious medical conditions following perceived attacks. And after hearing your testimonies, it sounds like all three of you believe that these are hostile actions orchestrated by our adversaries against American citizens. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Not all of them, of course.
Okay. And I can't remember which one of you said at least 68 incidents that you believe to be attacks using these type of weapons. Is that correct?
At least 68 incidents, I said, cannot be explained away with pre-existing conditions or psychosomatic symptoms.
Can you go over again real quick, Mr. Groza, why you believe that our nation's own law enforcement and intelligence investigations have concluded the opposite of the claims made here today?
One general observation, and again, I don't know the answer, but based on my 10 years of investigation of Russian intelligence operations and observing the parallel findings of law enforcement and intelligence publications, I find that there's an over-reliance on something that a colleague and a victim, a colleague of the victims and a victim himself, called the drinking straw insight that is unfortunately used for many of the conclusions. Reliance on human intelligence sources that may be recruited within the Russian intelligence community, who are asked, do you know if this is you guys? And the answer may be no, and that may be a very honest, sincere answer. From my investigation, it's clear that any operation like this is heavily compartmentalized and it's firewalled to a degree where even other members of the same unit might not be aware that this has been going on. And to rely on human intelligence for conclusions of this stature is probably very inefficient. What we do find is unexplained travel. We find unexplained communications that all point to a very plausible and internally consistent theory that these people are behind the attacks. Again, I can see several reasons why the U.S. intelligence might not want to make that public, but they must make it known to qualified and in a secure setting and provide answers to our findings.
Guys, if your assessments here are correct, these are very covert weapons, aren't they? They don't leave behind bomb fragments, bullet holes, etc. They could absolutely be used by our adversaries and have very low levels of, very easy to deny that they were even there, that they were used. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's no entry or exit wound. How they're designed is to make the target feel like they're crazy, like they're imagining things, especially on the low duration, the low intensity, long duration hits.
But you were saying that the targets are most often always either CIA, FBI, intelligence, law enforcement individuals. Is that correct?
No, I said Diplomats, intelligence community, and Department of Defense make up the lion's share. You often don't hear about the Department of Defense, despite DoD having 5 or 10 times the number of survivors that Department of State has.
Thank you for that correction, sir. And you guys also said that these attacks are happening right here in this city. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Can you expound on that a little bit more?
I mean, there have been some that have gone public with respect to Washington, D.C. The particularly credible ones, and I'm not saying that those are not credible, but the ones that have received the most attention on the inside of the intelligence community are in Northern Virginia, and they are particularly of CIA personnel.
I think it was Mr. Grozev said, you spoke to a Russian agent who said that they believe that Americans are using these same weapons on them. Is that correct?
That is correct, back in the 80s.
Might that have something to do with part of the CIA's motive to cover up the existence of this tech and these weapons?
That is a very logical possibility.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman, for his round of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Grozev, I want to follow up a little bit on the interactions you've had with Russian intelligence about these AHIs. If you had a conversation with an intelligence officer a Russian intelligence officer where he or she said that these are the same weapons that were used in the 1980s, isn't that an admission that they know they're using them now?
It is an admission that it's very plausible that they're being used now because the person was not privy to this particular operation. He is or she is retired, but again, the important thing is that he was serving at a time when there was a concerted effort for the Russian intelligence services to develop a counter weapon, and he believed, given time passed since then, it has been developed.
I see. So he has retired, but believes that based on the similar symptoms, or what other factors went into his?
Very, very similar symptoms were being conveyed in terms of Soviet diplomats stationed abroad of intelligence background had returned back to Russia to the Soviet Union with symptoms that they believed were caused by an acoustic weapon. That was their belief. It's not the fact that it is what happened. But again, it explains partly the motivation for them to develop a weapon that will be targeting exactly the type of people that we see being targeted.
And I know there's some geospatial data that indicates there were Russian intelligence officers near alleged incidents abroad. Do any of you know whether that is also the case for any of the incidents that have been reported domestically?
I do not have that data because the particular unit that we've focused on, they would not dare come to the United States. Therefore, if the Russians were doing this on US soil, they would have used sleepers, long-term proxies that would be here. But that is not a unit that I've discovered in my own career.
And therefore, difficult to identify as affiliated with Russian intelligence.
Sir, I think you should refer that last question to the FBI and classified spaces.
Yeah, obviously, the episode with my client, an active FBI agent that was authorized to speak to 60 Minutes, talks about an incident in Key West, and most of that information is either law enforcement sensitive or classified.
Are any of you aware of any reported incidents from individuals who are not members of the United States government, domestically, I should say?
I am not, but I will throw a caveat in there. Generally, I only focused on former and current government employees that were attacked.
Mr. Zaid, are you?
There are many people who believe they are victims of AHIs. All you have to do is look at my Twitter feed whenever I post on the topic. I only represent federal government employees and their families, so I don't focus on the accuracy of those particular claims.
And Mr. Grozev, do you have any insight?
Not on American soil, but in other parts of the world, there have been complaints that appear to be credible from Russian activists or Russian opposition leaders living abroad.
And Mr. Zaid, I want to ask, and this is a hypothetical, but I'm trying to understand why our government would try to block information sharing or conceal information that they have. And one thing that comes to mind is whether there's an operational risk to revealing any of the details of their investigation. Is that something that you have come across in any of your work?
Yes, and quickly, because I know your time is elapsing here. So I do think that is, and I agree with Mr. Grozev, there's a lot of reasons why the information might not be publicly released. And I do think that's something we could address more in a classified environment to explain that. But there are understandable reasons why the U.S. government has not revealed much of what it knows. But the question is, how about to you?
But also, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to follow up on that, there is a conclusion that has been made public that it is highly, highly, highly unlikely, I forgot what the language is, that these symptoms were caused by some sort of foreign malign actor.
So the last ODNI assessment that came out in 2023 had indicated, and it, to the public, it seems very damning. It's highly unlikely that a foreign adversary was involved. But if you actually look at the levels within each of the agencies as to the level of credibility that they have assessed to that is actually quite low for most of them. And there's a lot of pushback, even internally, among some of the intelligence agencies as to the qualification of that information. I'll say just very quickly, finally, they talk about, in particular, I think one of the CIA's public documents, that many of these cases can be explained through environmental factors, pre-existing medical conditions, but they don't explain any of that, which could easily be said in another sentence. The environmental factors include the following, whatever, whatever. We looked at prior health conditions, and 85% had football injuries when they played in high school and college. None of that information is in there, which leads one to believe that there's something more. The other thing I'll say just really quickly on that, the news media missed the story on that CIA assessment. They said they looked at more than 1,000 cases and they concluded the vast majority could be explained otherwise. But there are at least 24 cases that even the CIA acknowledges they can't explain away by any other alternative factors. That, to me, is the story that should have been in the New York Times and the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, that there are 24 cases the CIA can't even explain away.
Is that part of your 68, Mr. Grozev?
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for indulging. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you. And I thank the chair and our ranking member for allowing me to wave on to this hearing. And I thank the panelists. This is an issue that I know well from 8 years on the House Intelligence Committee. And I first just want to say to Mr. Zaid that your clients, who you represent, are heroes, and the people who were subjected to this are American heroes. I've met a number of them, and they served their country abroad. They toiled away, oftentimes without their family, leaving everything here in the United States, and oftentimes without any of us really having a sense of what they are doing, and they were exposed to this. And this condition, when you meet with the victims, is completely debilitating. It changes your life, it turns it upside down, and if you're a young parent, life is already disorienting. And if you're subjected to this, it's even more difficult to be a parent. put yourself through this, the questions you have. But something that I've been struck by in meeting with so many of these victims is, yes, they want to get well themselves. They have an obligation to their families to take care of their families. They have expectations of the agencies that they work for. But in every single one of them, they want to share as much as possible to prevent the next attack. So their sense of duty, even after being attacked and even after being debilitated, is still, I don't want this to happen to somebody else. And Mr. Zaid, I don't know if you can animate that just a little bit as to the patriotism of the people you represent and wanting to get to the bottom of this.
No, thank you, Congressman. I agree 100%. And it was mentioned by Mr. Ed Green, the notion of these oftentimes are the best of the best who have been impacted. And I have heard repeatedly from so many of them that what they want to achieve here is to make sure that their peers, their colleagues, and their future colleagues do not have this happen to them. And they want to go back to work. I mean, this is, most of them were in their 30s and 40s when they were impacted and would still have long careers ahead of them. And they want nothing more than to put their efforts into working for the national security interests of the United States. They are true heroes. I agree 100%.
And as we think forward about, what can we do, and this is the Homeland Security Committee. Obviously, this issue crosses jurisdictions, the House Intelligence Committee, Armed Services Committee, and Homeland Security Committee. But I would just welcome from the Lieutenant Colonel, how should we be thinking about this on the homeland? And if this is indeed, a foreign adversary, using a technology or a technique, how do we prevent it from coming onto the homeland, where the target environment is even richer than Americans abroad?
Thank you, sir. First of all, I must say that, yes, there's much needed legislation. We need a new Havana Act, something that's not a one-term payment. It was a great step in the right direction, but it had some shortcomings that we're going to fix in the next go-around. What you're referring to would obviously have to fall under the next Homeland Security Act and securing our borders. Because if I, hypothetically, was going to plan an operation, I'd have to get a couple guys across our border. They would go pick up a weapon and then start surveilling a target and then hit them and then disappear. And so I think there's a larger question there that I'm not qualified to answer, but there's some long-term things that needs to be done in terms of new acts. But in the short term, we need to do things like implement the original Havana Act. Yeah. DOD still hasn't done it. They still have not implemented the Havana Act. And we need a VA diagnostic code. Thanks to the VFW brothers and sisters that are here today and for your meeting earlier, we don't have a VA diagnostic code for the 500-some DOD survivors. Yeah. How are they going to get long-term care and disability without that?
Yeah. Well, I hope this issue you see in a room that is often contentious, explosive, volcanic, that you've got members on both sides who first honor and salute the victims and want to do everything we can to make sure that they're made whole, and if they can return. And then, of course, as the victims have wanted to do, make sure we do everything possible to prevent anyone else from suffering from this. And I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.